Good evening, dear listener, or perhaps good night. Welcome to this peaceful corner of storytelling. Make yourself comfortable. Perhaps imagine a warm cup of tea cradled in your hands, the steam rising gently, carrying the faint scent of chamomile or Earl Grey. Let your shoulders soften, your breathing slow. Tonight, we share a calm mystery with Miss Marple, one that unfolds like a quiet conversation by the fire. If these soothing tales bring you rest and gentle pleasure, do consider subscribing for more comforting mysteries to ease you into sleep. Now, settle in and let us begin. In the gentle village of St. Mary Mead, where days drift like leaves on a slow stream, there stands an old grandfather clock in the sitting room of Miss Jane Marple. It has kept time faithfully for decades, until one quiet morning, it simply stopped. Not with a dramatic crash, but with the softest sigh of stillness. And in that frozen moment, something ordinary revealed itself to be not quite what it seemed. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginning. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair beside the bay window, where the morning sun always arrived in the gentlest possible way. The light slipped through fine lace curtains that her mother had made 60 years earlier, casting soft, shifting patterns across the faded turkey carpet. Everything in the room was familiar, comforting, arranged just so. The small rosewood table holding her work basket, the low shelf of well-read books bound in green and brown leather, the cluster of porcelain shepherdesses on the mantel, each one dusted with the same careful affection week after week. And in the far corner, on standing tall and dignified against the wall, the grandfather clock that had once belonged to her father. It was a handsome piece, made in the time of Queen Victoria, its oak case polished to a warm glow by generations of hands. The face was cream-colored with black Roman numerals, the hands slender and black. The second hand, a thin red line that had ticked faithfully through wars, weddings, births, and ordinary Tuesdays alike. Every quarter hour, it played a soft, melodic chime. 4 notes ascending, then descending, like a polite reminder that time was passing. But there was no need to hurry. The villagers of St. Mary Mead had grown so accustomed to its voice that on still evenings they could sometimes hear it faintly from the lane outside, a distant, reassuring heartbeat. Miss Marple was knitting. Her needles moved with the slow, eurythmic certainty of someone who had knitted through many decades of quiet thought. The wool was a delicate lavender, chosen specially for the shawl she was making for young Mrs. Price, whose first child was due in 6 weeks. The pattern was simple, eyelet lace along the edges, a gentle scallop that would frame the baby's face like petals. She worked without looking down very often. Her fingers knew the stitches by heart, leaving her mind free to wander pleasantly over small observations. The way the postman's bicycle bell had sounded a little sharper this morning, perhaps because of the frost on the handlebars. The precise shade of pink in the early roses that climbed the wall outside. The faint scent of wood smoke drifting in from someone's chimney. And she had already poured her first cup of tea from the flowered china pot that matched the shepherdesses. The tea was Earl Grey, fragrant with bergamot, and she had added just the right amount of milk. Not too much to cloud it, not too little to cool it too quickly. The second cup waited on the little table beside her, steam curling upward in lazy spirals. She reached for it, brought it carefully to her lips, and took a small, appreciative sip. That was when she noticed the silence. Normally, At 9 o'clock precisely, or within a minute either way, the clock would have begun its gentle preparation. First, the soft whir of the mechanism gathering itself, then the four clear notes of the quarter hour, followed by the deeper, slower striking of the hour. 9 strokes, measured and unhurried. Miss Marple had lived with that rhythm for so long that its absence registered not as a shock, but as a small, polite interruption, like a guest who had forgotten to knock. She lowered the cup slowly and turned her head toward the clock. The pendulum hung motionless. The hands stood still at exactly 20 minutes past 7. 20 past 7. She set the cup down without a sound and rose from the chair, smoothing the skirt of her soft grey dress as she did so. Her slippers made no noise on the carpet as she crossed the room. Up close, the clock looked quite ordinary. Nothing cracked, nothing obviously broken. The glass door over the face was closed and latched. The long, narrow door below, which gave access to the weights and pendulum, remained shut. The brass weights, cylindrical, heavy, or polished, hung in their usual positions on the chains. Nothing appeared out of place. "Well now," she murmured, her voice soft as if speaking to an old friend who might be listening. "What has happened to you, old friend?" She adjusted her spectacles, which had slipped a fraction down her nose, and peered more closely at the face. 20 past 7. Not an hour that carried any particular drama. No midnight mystery, no dawn promise. Just an ordinary, in-between moment of the day. She had been awake at 7 that morning, as always, making her bed with hospital corners, washing at the small basin in her bedroom, then coming downstairs to open the curtains and let the light in. The clock had been ticking then. She remembered the sound quite clearly as she buttered her toast. So it had stopped sometime after she went upstairs to dress for the day, and before she returned to pour her tea. She considered winding it. The key hung on a small brass hook beside the case, where it had always hung. But something stayed her hand. It was not fear, nor even strong curiosity yet, just a quiet sense that this particular stillness deserved a moment of attention before being disturbed. She stepped back and regarded the clock as a whole. Tall, upright, immovable in its corner, yet now strangely silent. A stopped clock, she reflected, was right twice a day. At 20 past 7 in the morning, and again at 20 past 7 in the evening. A small philosophical comfort, perhaps, but also a reminder that even something as reliable as time could pause, could choose, or be made to choose, a moment of rest. Outside, a blackbird sang briefly from the apple tree, then fell quiet again. The village beyond her garden wall moved at its usual gentle pace. A bicycle bell in the distance, the soft clop of a milk pony's hooves on the lane, the murmur of two neighbors greeting one another over a fence. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. Yet inside her sitting room, time had decided to wait. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picked up her knitting once more, and resumed the lavender stitches. She did not glance at the clock again. Not yet. There would be time enough for questions later. For now, she simply allowed the silence to settle around her like a soft blanket, warm and familiar in its own way. The stopped clock stood patiently in its corner, hands fixed, pendulum still, as if it had all the time in the world. And perhaps, in its own quiet fashion, it did. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. Miss Marple continued with her lavender shawl for the remainder of the morning. The needles clicked softly against one another. a gentle counterpoint to the unusual quiet that now filled the sitting room. Every so often, her eyes would lift to the grandfather clock, still motionless at 7:20, and then return to her work without comment. There was no hurry. Mysteries, she had long ago learned, were like good tea. They improved when allowed to steep slowly. Around 11:30, she set the knitting aside, rose, smoothed her cardigan, and decided a short walk to the village shop would do her good. The air outside was crisp but kind, the sort of late autumn day that carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires without any real chill. When she put on her second best hat, the small felt one with the narrow ribbon, and took her string bag from the hook by the door. The lane to the high street was quiet. A few late roses still clung to garden walls, their petals softened by recent rain. Mrs. Bontree's tabby cat watched her from the top of a gatepost with the calm superiority only cats can manage. Miss Marple nodded politely to the cat and continued on. At the village shop, known simply as Dane's, since old Mr. Dane had taken it over in 1923, Mrs. Dane was behind the counter, arranging tins of biscuits into neat pyramids. She was a round, cheerful woman in her late 50s, her apron always dusted with a faint film of flour, even when she hadn't been baking. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she called brightly. "Or should I say, good almost noon? You're a little later than usual today." Miss Marple smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Dane. I allowed myself an extra cup of tea. The mornings do seem to stretch when one lingers over them." Mrs. Dane laughed. "That they do. Now then, what can I get you? The usual digestive biscuits, or perhaps something a bit more indulgent? We've just had a fresh delivery of those shortbread fingers Mr. Price likes so much." "A small tin of shortbread would be lovely," Miss Marple replied, "and half a pound of the Ceylon tea, if you please. Oh, and perhaps you could tell me something. I couldn't help noticing this morning that my grandfather clock has stopped." Mrs. Dane paused with a tin in her hand. "Stopped? Goodness, mine too." Miss Marple tilted her head very slightly, the way she did when something interesting had just presented itself. "Yours as well?" she asked mildly. "Yes, the little mantel clock in the parlor behind the shop. It was ticking away happily when I came down at 6:30 to open up, and then nothing. I looked at it just before you came in. Frozen at 7:20, same as anything. I thought perhaps the spring had given out, but it's not that old. Only wound it last night, regular as clockwork, pardon the expression." Miss Marple accepted the tin of shortbread and watched Mrs. Dane weigh the tea. 7:20, she repeated softly. "An interesting hour to choose for stopping." Mrs. Dane wrapped the tea in brown paper and tied it with string. "I thought the same. Not dramatic like midnight, is it? Just ordinary." I was quite put out at first. Couldn't tell when the bread man was due without looking out the window every 5 minutes. But then I heard something even odder. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the shop. Mr. Hargrove was in earlier. You know Mr. Hargrove, the retired solicitor who lives in the big house on Willow Lane. He came to collect his newspaper and mentioned, quite cross he was, that his drawing room mantel clock had stopped too. Exact same time, 7:20 on the dot. He said it had never failed him in 32 years, not even during the war when the house shook from the bombs falling on London. Miss Marple accepted her change and placed the coins carefully in her purse. 3 clocks, she murmured. all stopping at precisely the same moment, that does begin to feel less like coincidence. Mrs. Dane nodded vigorously. And there's more. Old Mrs. Pettigrew popped in just after Mr. and Hargrove left. She has that sweet little carriage clock on her hall table. The one with the porcelain face and the tiny painted roses. She said it stopped too. Same time. She was quite shaken, relies on it to remind her when to take her heart tablets in the evening. Without it, she feels quite adrift. Miss Marple considered this. No noise in the night, no storm, no one moving furniture or anything of that sort. Not a sound, Mrs. Dane replied. I sleep with the window open a crack even in winter, and I heard nothing unusual. Mind you, I do sleep soundly. But Mr. Hargrove is a light sleeper. Says he would have heard a mouse crossing the landing, and he heard nothing either. Miss Marple tucked the shortbread tin into her string bag. Thank you, Mrs. Dane. That is most interesting. Most interesting indeed. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Dane called after her. You don't suppose it's something in the air, do you? Some sort of magnetic disturbance. I read in a magazine once about clocks going wrong because of sunspots. Miss Marple paused at the door, one hand on the latch. Sunspots, she repeated thoughtfully. Perhaps. Though I believe sunspots usually affect wireless sets more than grandfather clocks. Still, one never knows. She stepped outside into the mild sunshine. On her way home, she passed the post office, where young Timothy, the postman, was sorting letters on the bench outside. He was a tall, rather gangly young man of 24, with a perpetually cheerful expression and a habit of whistling tunelessly while he worked. Morning, Miss Marple, he said, touching his cap. Lovely day for it. Good morning, Timothy. Yes, quite lovely. She hesitated, nor then added casually, I suppose you've heard about the clocks? Timothy looked up from his sorting. The stopped ones? Aye. My mum's little alarm clock in the kitchen did the same. 7:20. She was ever so cross. Nearly missed putting the porridge on for my dad. Miss Marple smiled. Four now then. Your mother's, Mrs. Dane's, Mr. Hargrove's, Mrs. Pettigrew's, and my own grandfather clock. Timothy gave a low whistle. That's a proper mystery, that is, all at once. Like they held a meeting and decided to go on strike together. Perhaps they did, Miss Marple said gently. Though clocks rarely organize themselves, usually there is a little human assistance involved somewhere. Timothy laughed, but there was a flicker, something very quick in his eyes. Miss Marple noticed it, the way one notices a leaf trembling on a still day. Well, she said, I must be getting home. Good day, Timothy. Good day, Miss Marple. She walked on slowly, the string bag swinging lightly against her side. The stopped clocks were no longer isolated incidents. 4 of them, perhaps more she had not yet heard about, all halting at the same unlikely moment. 7:20. Not a round hour, not a quarter or half, just 7:20. She reached her gate, paused to admire the last of the Michaelmas daisies still blooming along the path, then let herself into the house. The grandfather clock stood exactly as she had left it, silent, dignified, frozen at 7:20. Miss Marple set her purchases on the kitchen table, filled the kettle, and put it on to boil. While she waited for the water, she returned to the sitting room and stood once more before the tall oak case. And she did not touch it, not yet. Instead, she spoke to it softly, as one might speak to a shy child. "Now then," she said, "what have you been up to? And why, of all the hours in the day, did you choose 7:20 to stop?" The clock offered no reply, but in the stillness of the room, Miss Marple felt the first small thread of curiosity tighten into something firmer. Something slightly unusual had indeed occurred, and she intended, quietly, patiently, in her own time, to discover exactly what it was. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The afternoon light had softened to a pale gold by the time Miss Marple finished her lunch. A small slice of cold ham, a boiled egg, and a slice of brown bread with a thin spread of butter. She washed the few dishes carefully, dried them, and put them away in their accustomed places. Routine, she always found, was a gentle anchor when something unusual drifted into view. She returned to the sitting room with a fresh pot of tea and settled once more into her armchair. The grandfather clock remained silent at 7:20, its hands like two thin black needles pinned to the cream dial. She no longer felt the need to stare at it. Instead, she let it occupy the edge of her vision while she resumed her knitting. The lavender shawl had grown several inches since morning. Row by row, stitch by stitch, the pattern emerged. Quiet, predictable, soothing. Yet her mind was not idle. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple moved through her usual small orbits of village life with the same unhurried grace she always employed. But now, with an extra layer of quiet attention, she listened more than she spoke, observed more than she remarked upon, and noted the tiny habits and rhythms that people carried without ever thinking about them. On Wednesday morning, she walked to the vicarage to return a borrowed book of garden essays. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, greeted her at the door with flour on her apron and the warm smell of baking scones drifting from the kitchen. Come in, Miss Marple. Just in time for 11s. I've made too many again. James will never eat them all." Miss Marple accepted a scone with jam and sat by the fire while Mrs. Clement bustled about. Between mouthfuls of tea and polite conversation about the church flower rota, Miss Marple gently steered the talk toward clocks. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Clement said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Our little bracket clock in the study stopped too. Same morning, same time, 7:20. James was quite puzzled. He wound it Sunday evening, as usual. Said it was keeping perfect time when he went to bed." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "5 now then. My grandfather, Mrs. Dane's mantle, Mr. Hargrove's drawing room, Mrs. Pettigrew's carriage clock, and now the vicarage bracket clock. All at precisely 7:20. Mrs. Clement laughed softly. "The village is calling it the morning the clocks went on holiday. Someone even suggested we hold a little service to bless them all back into working order." Miss Marple smiled. "A charming idea, though I suspect the clocks themselves are quite innocent." She left the vicarage with another small observation tucked away. The vicar himself had been seen winding the study clock at 8 o'clock every Sunday evening for 30 years. Always 8, and never 7:45 or 8:15. A habit as fixed as the sunrise. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on old Mrs. Pettigrew, taking with her a small jar of homemade quince jelly. Mrs. Pettigrew lived in a tiny cottage at the end of Cherry Tree Lane, its windowsills crowded with geraniums, even in November. She welcomed Miss Marple with genuine pleasure and insisted on making fresh tea. While the kettle sang, Mrs. Pettigrew spoke of her carriage clock with a mixture of fondness and worry. "It's been with me since my Arthur gave it to me on our silver wedding anniversary. Never missed a beat. And now, nothing. stopped dead at 20 past 7. I keep glancing at it, expecting it to start again any moment, but it just sits there, looking reproachful. Miss Marple listened, nodding gently. You take your heart tablets at 7:30 every evening, don't you, dear? Yes, precisely. The doctor was most particular. 7:30 after supper. Without the clock, I get quite muddled. Take them too early or too late. Yesterday, I nearly forgot altogether. Miss Marple patted the older woman's hand. Perhaps for a day or two, you might set your little traveling alarm instead, just until things are put right. Mrs. Pettigrew brightened. What a sensible idea. I shall do that at once. As Miss Marple walked home, she reflected on the pattern that was slowly forming. Each stopped clock belonged to someone who wound it at a regular, predictable time the evening before. Each person relied on their clock for something small but important. Medicine, bread delivery, the comfort of routine. And each clock had stopped at the same improbable moment. Later that evening, while she was deadheading the last of the chrysanthemums in her front garden, young Timothy the postman cycled past on his final round. He slowed when he saw her. Evening, Miss Marple. Still no ticking from the old grandfather? Not yet, Timothy. And you? Your mother's alarm clock? Still quiet as the grave, he said cheerfully. Mum's using the church bells now. Says they're free and never need winding. Miss Marple straightened, brushing soil from her hands. You were up early the morning the clock stopped, weren't you? I seem to remember seeing your bicycle light going along the lane just after 7. Timothy hesitated for the briefest second, long enough for Miss Marple to notice, short enough for most people to miss. I, he said, had to catch the early train to Milchester to pick up some special stamps for Mr. Hargrove. He's a collector, you know. Wanted them for a letter he was sending. Very diligent of you, Miss Marple replied mildly. And you were back in time for the morning round? Oh, yes. Got the 7:40 back, all sorted. He touched his cap and pedaled on, whistling again. That same tuneless little tune. Miss Marple watched him go, then returned to her flowers. She had noticed something else that afternoon when she passed Mr. Hargrove's house on her way to the shop. Through the drawing-room window, she had seen him standing before his mantel clock, still stopped at 20 past 7, checking his pocket watch against it with a small frown. He had looked distracted, almost anxious. Not the usual calm of a retired solicitor enjoying his leisure. And on the mantel beside the stopped clock had sat a small plain parcel, wrapped in brown paper and string, still unopened. The postmark she had been able to glimpse from the lane was London, posted the day before the clock stopped. She carried these small fragments back into the house with her like pieces of embroidery, waiting to be stitched together. That night, before she went upstairs to bed, Miss Marple stood once more before her grandfather clock. She touched the oak case lightly with her fingertips. You've seen a great many things in your time, she said softly. And now you've chosen to be silent at a very particular moment. I wonder, who helped you make that choice? The clock offered no answer, of course. But in the quiet of the house, with only the faint tick of the kitchen clock in the distance, the one she had wound herself that evening, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery beginning to draw closer. Not dramatically, not with sudden revelation, just gently, patiently, the way a ball of wool slowly unravels when one knows exactly where to pull. She turned off the lamp, took her candle, and climbed the stairs to bed. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring more small observations. and sooner or later, they would speak. Chapter 4. A Calm Contradiction. Thursday arrived, wrapped in a thin mist that clung to the hedgerows and softened every outline in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple woke early, as always, and after her morning rituals, bed made, small wash, cup of tea drunk, standing at the kitchen window, she returned to the sitting room. The grandfather clock had not moved. At 7:20 remained its fixed declaration, calm and unapologetic. She did not feel impatient. Instead, she carried her breakfast tray to the small table beside the armchair, arranged a slice of toast, a little marmalade, and the morning newspaper, then sat down to eat slowly while the house settled around her in its familiar hush. By 10 o'clock, the mist had lifted, leaving the garden sparkling. Miss Marple put on her gardening gloves, took her secateurs, and spent a contented half-hour pruning the last of the faded hydrangeas. The work was gentle, repetitive, perfect for thinking, and as she snipped, she turned over the small facts she had gathered like pebbles smoothed by a slow river. 5, no, 6 now. Clocks had stopped at exactly 7:20 on Tuesday morning. Each belonged to someone who wound it faithfully the evening before. Each person depended on their clock for something precise. Medicine at 7:30, bread delivery at 8, the comfort of knowing the hour without glancing at a wristwatch. No one had reported any sound in the night. No creaking floorboards, no rattling windows, no footsteps on gravel. Yet 6 reliable timepieces had all chosen the same unlikely instant to fall silent. She returned indoors, washed her hands, and made fresh tea. While the kettle warmed, she stood once more before the grandfather clock. This time she decided it was time to look more closely. She opened the tall, narrow door at the base of the case. The pendulum hung motionless, its brass bob gleaming dully in the daylight. The 2 cylindrical weights rested at the bottom of their travel, a chain slack, yet they had not reached the floor. Normally, when a clock ran down completely, the weights would lie flat against the baseboard. Here they dangled an inch or two above it, as though the mechanism had halted midway through its cycle. Miss Marple took a small torch from the drawer of the side table and shone it upward into the workings. Everything appeared orderly, the escapement clean, the gears free of obvious dust or rust, the pendulum rod straight. She gave the pendulum the gentlest of pushes with one finger. It swung once, twice, then slowed and stopped almost at once, returning to the same central position. Not caught, not jammed by grit or wear, simply unwilling to continue. She closed the door softly and stepped back. Then she noticed something she had overlooked before. On the brass faceplate, just below the Roman numeral 7, there was a faint, narrow scratch, barely visible unless the light caught it at precisely the right angle. It was not deep, not clumsy, more like the mark left by something sharp and careful, brushing past in a single motion. And on the carpet, directly beneath the clock, caught on a tiny splinter of the oak skirting board, was a single dark thread. Wool, perhaps, or fine cotton. Dark grey, almost black. Miss Marple knelt carefully, retrieved the thread with tweezers from her work basket, and held it to the light. It was short, barely 2 centimeters, but unmistakable. She placed it between the pages of an old notebook for safekeeping. She sat again, hands folded in her lap, and allowed the contradiction to settle quietly in her mind. If the clocks had simply run down, the weights would have descended fully, and if they had been stopped by mechanical failure, one would expect variation, some halting at 10 past, others at 25 past. Yet all had frozen at precisely 20 past 7, and if someone had deliberately stopped them, why choose an hour so lacking in drama? Midnight suggested mystery, 6 o'clock suggested routine beginnings or endings. 20 past 7 was nothing, an in-between time, unless the in-betweenness itself was the point. She rose and walked to the window. Outside, the lane was empty, save for a boy on a bicycle delivering newspapers. Life continued in its small, ordinary way. Yet the scratch and the thread spoke of a human hand, careful, deliberate, close enough to touch the face of the clock without forcing the mechanism violently. Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The lavender wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. As she worked, she considered the contradiction further. A stopped clock tells the correct time twice each day, at 20 past 7 in the morning and again at 20 past 7 in the evening. Therefore, anyone who wished to draw attention to that specific time could rely on the stopped clocks to reinforce it, provided the clocks were seen soon after they halted. But why reinforce 20 past 7 at all? She remembered Mr. Hargrove's distracted manner when she had glimpsed him through his window, the unopened parcel on his mantel, the way Timothy had hesitated, just for a heartbeat, when she mentioned being up early that Tuesday. And then there was the matter of the station clock. Miss Marple had not visited the railway station herself, but she recalled a conversation at the shop 2 days earlier. Old Mr. Sims, who collected tickets at Milchester Station, had mentioned to Mrs. Dane that young Timothy had bought a ticket to London very early Tuesday morning, around 20 past 7, he thought. Yet when Mr. Sims checked the station clock later, it had shown 20 to 8. A small difference. 20 minutes versus 10 minutes to the hour. Easily dismissed as a faulty memory. Unless one began to wonder whether someone had needed the village to believe 20 past 7 was the exact moment something important occurred. The contradiction lay there, calm and unhurried. The stopped clocks were not accidents. They were not failures of mechanism or weather or sunspots. They were instruments, delicate, precise, chosen for their reliability. And someone had used time itself to create a small illusion, an illusion built on the simple truth that a stopped clock is right twice a day and can therefore be made to seem right at the very moment it matters most. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The pace of the mystery had not quickened. There was still no need for haste. She continued knitting, row after row, while the afternoon light moved slowly across the carpet. Outside, a thrush began to sing from the apple tree, clear, untroubled notes. Inside, the grandfather clock remained at 20 past 7, silent witness to a contradiction that was beginning, very gently, to resolve itself into shape. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. Friday morning brought a gentle brightness to St. Mary Mead, the kind of light that makes every leaf and petal seem freshly washed. And Miss Marple woke with the same quiet sense of purpose she had carried through the week. After her usual morning rituals, bed smoothed, small wash completed, tea poured, and sipped slowly at the kitchen table, she returned to the sitting room. The grandfather clock stood unchanged, hands locked at 20 past 7, pendulum still as stone. She no longer felt the need to open its door or push the pendulum. The mechanism had spoken as much as it was going to. Now it was for her to listen to the people instead. She decided a second visit to the village shop was in order. Not for necessities this time, her larder was well stocked, but for the small, casual conversations that so often carried the final piece of a puzzle. She put on her everyday coat, the soft grey one with the velvet collar, tucked a clean handkerchief into her sleeve, and set out. And the high street was peaceful. A milk cart rattled past, the pony's hooves making a soft rhythmic clop against the cobbles. Miss Marple walked slowly, nodding to neighbors, pausing once to admire Mrs. Bantry's late-blooming chrysanthemums through the gate. By the time she reached Dane's shop, the bell above the door gave its familiar ting as she entered. Mrs. Dane looked up from weighing sugar and smiled warmly. "Back again so soon, Miss Marple. You'll be keeping me in business single-handed." Miss Marple returned the smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Dane. I thought perhaps a small packet of your best loose-leaf tea. The salon is running low." While Mrs. Dane measured out the tea, Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift naturally. "I was thinking about Mr. Hargrove's parcel," she said mildly. The one young Timothy delivered the afternoon before the clock stopped. You mentioned it was a clock weight, I believe?" Mrs. Dane nodded as she folded the paper packet. "That's right. He'd ordered it special from a shop in London. Said his old pendulum bob had worn thin after all these years. Timothy brought it round about 4 o'clock Monday afternoon. Mr. Hargrove signed for it himself." Miss Marple accepted the tea and placed it carefully in her string bag. "And Timothy mentioned it was surprisingly heavy for its size." "Yes, he did say that. Made a little joke about it nearly pulling his arm off on the bicycle ride up Willow Lane. But then, parcels can be deceptive, can't they?" "They can indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Deceptive in the most ordinary ways." She paid, thanked Mrs. Dane, and stepped outside. And instead of turning directly for home, she continued along the lane toward Willow Lane. The walk was not long, and the air was fresh enough to make it pleasant. Mr. Hargrove's house stood set back behind a low stone wall and a neat privet hedge. Through the drawing-room window, she could see the mantel clock still stopped at 7:20, and beside it, the small brown paper parcel remained exactly where she had last seen it, unopened, string still neatly tied. She hesitated only a moment before opening the gate and walking up the short path. Mr. Hargrove answered the door himself, looking a trifle surprised but not displeased. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. Do come in. I was just having a cup of coffee." She accepted with thanks and followed him into the drawing room. The fire was low but cheerful, on the room smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. Mr. Hargrove gestured to the armchair opposite his own. "Still no movement from the clocks, I see," Miss Marple observed, glancing at the mantel. "None whatever," he replied with a small sigh. "I've half a mind to call in a clockmaker from Milchester, but it seems absurd when they all failed at once, almost as if they conspired." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Conspired clocks? Now that would be a story." They spoke for a few minutes of village matters, the church roof fund, the new postbox on the green, before she brought the conversation back with careful lightness. "I wonder," she said, "if I might have a closer look at that parcel on your mantel. The one Timothy delivered. I find myself rather curious about clock weights just now." Mr. Hargrove raised an eyebrow, but rose without protest. "By all means. I haven't opened it yet. Meant to return it when I discovered it was the wrong size. Too small by half, I think." He brought the parcel to the low table between them and untied the string with steady fingers. Inside the brown paper was a small cardboard box, plain and unmarked, save for a London postmark and a printed label. Precision Horological Supplies, Limited. Mr. Hargrove lifted the lid. Nestled in a bed of wood shavings lay not a brass pendulum bob, but a small, heavy cylinder of dull lead, perfectly machined, about the diameter of a large coin, but twice as thick. It weighed perhaps half a pound, solid and cold to the touch. Mr. Hargrove frowned. This isn't what I ordered at all. I asked for a replacement bob, brass, polished, the standard 7-inch swing weight. Yet this looks more like, well, like a fishing sinker. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Heavy, she murmured. Surprisingly heavy for its size, as Timothy said. She asked if she might hold it. Mr. Hargrove passed it to her. The cylinder felt dense, balanced, almost perfectly made to slip quietly into the path of a pendulum when the clock reached a certain point in its swing. Not to break anything, only to interrupt. Miss Marple turned it slowly in her hands. You wound your clock, Monday evening as usual. At 8 o'clock precisely, he confirmed. Same as always. And the parcel arrived shortly after 4. You set it aside here, on the mantel. Yes, planned to open it after supper, but I became distracted with some correspondence. Miss Marple placed the lead cylinder back in its box. The next morning, at 7:20, your clock stopped, and so did several others. Mr. Hargrove looked at her steadily. You think this little thing? I think, Miss Marple said quietly, that someone replaced the real clock weight you ordered with this one, knowing it would reach the top of its swing at exactly 7:20, and lodged just so, bringing the pendulum to a gentle halt. Not violently, not obviously, just enough to stop the clock at the chosen moment. A long silence followed, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Mr. Hargrove exhaled slowly. But why on earth would anyone go to such trouble? And why involve half the village? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Not half the village, my dear. Just a few very reliable clocks belonging to very reliable people. People whose habits are known. People who wind their clocks at predictable times. And people whose stopped clocks would be noticed and remarked upon almost immediately. She paused, letting the thought settle. And 7:20, she continued softly, is not an arbitrary hour after all. It is the hour someone wished everyone to remember clearly. Because at that same moment, someone needed to be seen somewhere else, doing something quite ordinary, quite verifiable. An alibi built not on lies, but on the simple, mechanical truth of several stopped clocks. Mr. Hargrove stared at the lead cylinder as though seeing it for the first time. Miss Marple rose slowly. I believe the direction of this small mystery is becoming clearer now. Not dramatic, not alarming. Merely human. She thanked him for the coffee, promised to call again soon, and walked home through the bright morning light. Yet inside her own sitting room, she stood once more before the grandfather clock. The scratch on the brass faceplate near the 7, the dark thread caught on the skirting. Small signs of a careful hand that had visited in the night, slipped the lead cylinder into place, and left without disturbing a single other thing. The detail, the parcel, the weight had been revisited, and with it, the true shape of the mystery had begun, very gently to emerge. Chapter 6. Quiet Explanation. That same Friday evening, as the light began to fade into the soft grey of an autumn dusk, Miss Marple prepared her sitting room with the same gentle care she gave to everything. She drew the curtains halfway to keep the warmth in, lit the small fire in the grate, and arranged 4 chairs in a loose semicircle facing the hearth. And on the low table, she placed a tray, a pot of fresh tea under its knitted cozy, 4 china cups and saucers, a plate of seed cake sliced thinly, and a small dish of shortbread fingers. Nothing ostentatious, just the quiet hospitality of a neighbor inviting friends for a comfortable evening. At 6:30 precisely, the doorbell chimed its soft 2-note ring. Miss Marple opened the door to find Mr. Hargrove, Mrs. Pettigrew, and young Timothy standing together on the step, each looking a little uncertain but willing. Mr. Hargrove carried a small paper bag containing the lead cylinder. Mrs. Pettigrew held her shawl close against the evening chill. Timothy stood slightly behind them, cap in hand, expression subdued. "Do come in, all of you," Miss Marple said warmly. "The fire is going nicely, and the kettle has just boiled." She took their coats, hung them on the hall stand, and ushered them into the sitting room. The grandfather clock stood silent in its corner, hands still fixed at 7:20. But tonight no one stared at it with puzzlement. They simply settled into the chairs, accepted cups of tea, and waited. Miss Marple took her own seat last, smoothing her skirt before she began. Her voice was soft, unhurried, the same tone one might use to explain a knitting pattern or the proper way to prune roses. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know evenings are precious, especially when the days grow shorter. I asked you here not to accuse or to alarm, but simply to share what I have come to understand about our stopped clocks. And when we have finished, I believe we shall all feel a little more at peace." She lifted her cup, took a small sip, then set it down again. "Let us begin with the simplest truth," she continued. "A stopped clock is right twice each day, at the moment it stops, and again 12 hours later. In this case, every clock stopped at 7:20 on Tuesday morning. Therefore, each one was correct at 7:20 that morning, and again at 7:20 that evening." Mr. Hargrove nodded slowly. "We all noticed that. But why should it matter so much?" "Because," Miss Marple replied gently, "someone needed 7:20 to be remembered very clearly by several reliable witnesses. Not as a guess, not as an approximate time, but as an exact mechanical fact. When people saw their own clocks frozen at that hour, and heard the same from neighbors, and the time became fixed in everyone's mind, no one questioned it. It was simply true." Mrs. Pettigrew looked up from her cup. "But who would want such a thing?" Miss Marple turned her kind gaze towards Timothy. "Timothy," she said without sharpness, "you were seen at the railway station in Milchester at 7:20 that Tuesday morning. You bought a ticket to London. The station master, Mr. Sims, remembers it clearly, because he looked at his clock at that very moment and noted the time. Later, however, when he checked again, his clock showed 7:20, a small difference of 10 minutes, easily overlooked, unless one begins to wonder why the village clocks all agreed on 7:20, while the station clock did not." Timothy's shoulders sagged. He set his cup down carefully, hands trembling just a little. I didn't mean for it to go so far," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "I know, dear. Tell us in your own time." Timothy looked at the carpet for a long moment before he spoke. "There was an old debt," he began, "from before my father passed, a small amount, but it had grown with interest. The man who held the note, he lives in London now, said he would forgive it if I paid half by the end of the month. I didn't have the money, but I knew Mr. Hargrove kept a little cash box in his study desk for emergencies. I thought If I took just enough and left a note promising to repay it with my wages, it would be all right. No one would be hurt. Mr. Hargrove exhaled slowly but said nothing. I planned to do it early Tuesday morning, Timothy continued. Before anyone was awake, I knew Mr. Hargrove always wound his clock at 8 the night before. He's as regular as the post. So I came here first, very quietly, just after midnight. I used the spare key under the flower pot. Everyone knows it's there for emergencies. I opened the grandfather clock, slipped the lead cylinder I'd made into the pendulum path so it would jam exactly at 7:20 when the bob reached its highest swing. Then I went to Mrs. Pettigrew's, then the vicarage, then the shop after Mrs. Dane had gone up to bed. Always the same: open, insert, close. No damage, just a pause. Mrs. Pettigrew touched her throat. You were in my hall at night? Only for a moment, Timothy said, eyes down. I'm so sorry. I never touched anything else. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice steady and kind. Indeed, the lead cylinder was heavy enough to lodge gently when the pendulum reached the top of its arc. 7:20 on each clock's individual cycle. Since they had all been wound within an hour or so of each other the previous evening. You chose that hour because it gave you time to reach Milchester Station, be seen buying your ticket at what everyone would later believe was 7:20, then return on the 7:40 train. By the time the village woke and noticed their clocks had stopped, you would have an unbreakable alibi. You were miles away at the very moment the theft must have occurred. Timothy nodded miserably. I posted the parcel to Mr. Hargrove myself, the fake weight, on Monday, knowing it would arrive just in time. I thought, if everyone's clocks stopped at once, no one would suspect a break-in. They'd think it was some strange coincidence. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. But time, like truth, has a way of catching up, doesn't it? The scratch on my clock face, the thread on the skirting, the weight of the cylinder, your slight hesitation when I asked about your early morning. Small things, but they spoke. She paused, letting silence fill the room like warm air. You meant no lasting harm, Timothy. You planned to replace the money before anyone noticed it gone. But fear makes poor counselors, and a stopped clock may lie twice a day if someone uses it cleverly. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat. The money is still in the box? Yes, sir, Timothy whispered. I never took it. I lost my nerve when I saw how many people were talking about the clocks. I couldn't go through with it. Miss Marple smiled, small and gentle. Then no real theft has taken place. Only an error in judgment. And errors, when admitted, can be mended. She looked around at each of them. We need no police, no scandal. Timothy will repay the small cost of the lead and the postage with honest work, perhaps helping Mr. Hargrove in the garden or running errands for Mrs. Pettigrew. And the clocks? Well, they may be set going again tonight, all of them, at the proper hour. Mrs. Pettigrew reached over and patted Timothy's hand. We all make mistakes, lad. The important thing is what we do next. Mr. Hargrove nodded slowly. Agreed. Let it end here. The fire crackled softly. Tea was sipped. Seed cake was taken in small bites. The explanation had been given, not with drama, not with raised voices, but with the calm clarity of understanding one human heart by another. Outside, the night deepened peacefully over St. Mary Mead. Inside, order was quietly restored. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of quiet clarity that follows a gentle rain. The sky above St. Mary Mead was a pale washed blue, and a light breeze moved through the bare branches of the apple trees, carrying the faint, clean scent of wet earth. Miss Marple woke at her usual hour, drew back the bedroom curtains to let the light in, and felt the small, satisfying sense of something properly concluded. Downstairs, she moved through her morning with deliberate slowness. She made her bed with the same crisp corners she had used since girlhood, washed at the porcelain basin, dressed in her soft blue cardigan and grey skirt, and came down to the kitchen. The kettle sang on the stove, the toast browned under the grill, and the marmalade jar caught a slant of sunlight on the table. Ordinary rituals, yet today they carried an extra layer of contentment. After breakfast, she returned to the sitting room. The grandfather clock stood in its corner, hands still at 7:20. But now the silence felt different. Not a puzzle waiting to be solved, but a pause that had served its purpose. She opened the tall door at the base, removed the small lead cylinder she had placed there herself the previous evening, after Timothy had quietly confessed how he had positioned it, and set it aside on a saucer. Then she reached for the key on its brass hook, wound the mechanism with steady turns until the familiar tension returned, and gave the pendulum the gentlest push. It swung, once to the left, once to the right, slow, deliberate, alive again. The second hand began its thin red sweep. The minute hand crept forward. Within moments, the clock found its rhythm once more, ticking softly, steadily, as though it had never stopped at all. Miss Marple closed the door, stepped back, and watched the hands move from 7:20 toward 8 o'clock. The chime mechanism gave a small preparatory whir, then rang the quarter hour with its four clear musical notes, ascending, descending, familiar as a lullaby. She smiled, small and private. Outside, the village was waking in its own gentle way. From the lane came the soft clop of the milk pony, the jingle of bottles in crates, the murmur of greetings between neighbors. Life resumed without fanfare, as it always did. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage, carrying a small pot of lemon curd she had made the day before. Mrs. Clement welcomed her with open arms, and fresh scones still warm from the oven. Over tea in the cozy parlor, the vicar's wife mentioned that the bracket clock in the study had been set going again the previous evening. James wound it himself, she said. Said it started as sweetly as ever. Isn't it strange how they all came right at once? Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes things simply need a little encouragement to remember their proper place. Mrs. Clement laughed softly. You always have such a sensible way of putting things, Miss Marple. From the vicarage, she continued to Mrs. Pettigrew's cottage. The old lady was sitting by her window with her knitting, the little carriage clock on the hall table ticking once more. Its porcelain face, painted with tiny roses, caught the afternoon light. I set it myself last night, Mrs. Pettigrew said, patting the clock fondly. Right on the hour. And this morning, it woke me at 7 exactly, just as it should. I took my tablets at 7:30 without a worry in the world. Miss Marple accepted a cup of weak tea and a slice of seed cake. They spoke of small things, the price of wool, the early snowdrops already showing in the garden, the way the days were drawing out again. Neither mentioned Timothy by name, but the forgiveness hung quietly between them, unspoken and complete. Later, as the sun began to lower, Miss Marple passed Mr. Hargrove's house on Willow Lane. He was in the front garden, raking leaves into neat piles, his sleeves rolled up despite the cool air. Timothy was there too, working beside him with a second rake. They moved in companionable rhythm, the scrape of metal on stone a steady, unhurried sound. Mr. Hargrove looked up as she approached the gate. "Miss Marple, good afternoon. Come to see the garden in its winter clothes?" "Among other things," she replied, smiling. "I see the mantel clock is ticking again." "It is indeed. Set it myself last night. Timothy here helped me wind the weights, carefully, mind you. No more surprises." Timothy glanced up, cheeks a little pink, but his eyes were clear. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Thank you. For everything." She inclined her head. "You're doing very well, Timothy. Hard work mends a great many things." He nodded, returned to his raking. Mr. Hargrove leaned on his rake for a moment. "The cash box is untouched," he said quietly. "Not a penny missing. We've agreed he'll pay back the cost of the parcel and the London postage out of his wages over the next few months. After that, he'll stay on one afternoon a week to help in the garden. Fair recompense, I think." "More than fair," Miss Marple said gently. "It gives everyone something to hold on to. Work, trust, time moving forward again." Mr. Hargrove smiled, a rare, genuine softening of his usually formal expression. "You have a gift for seeing the human side of these things, Miss Marple. Not every mystery needs a courtroom." "No," she agreed. "Some are best settled by the fireside, with tea and understanding." She wished them both good afternoon and continued home along the lane. That evening, she sat once more in her armchair, the fire low but steady, the grandfather clock ticking its quiet, even measure. The lavender shawl for young Mrs. Price had grown several more inches. She worked on it slowly, her needles moving with the same calm certainty as the pendulum beside her. The stopped clock had never been a tragedy. It had been a small human mistake, a moment of fear, a clumsy attempt to borrow time, revealed not through accusation, but through patient observation and quiet kindness. No reputations ruined, no families broken, no lasting harm done. Only a lesson gently learned, and amends quietly made. Outside, the village settled into night. Lights appeared in windows like small warm stars. A dog barked once, far off. An owl called from the woods beyond the churchyard. Inside, the clock chimed 9 o'clock. 9 slow, measured strokes, each one clear and unhurried. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, rose, and turned off the lamp. She took a candle, climbed the stairs, and paused at the landing window to look out over the sleeping village. All was in order once more. Time moved forward, gentle and sure. She smiled to herself, blew out the candle, and slipped into bed. The house settled around her, the soft tick of the grandfather clock drifting up the stairs, the faint creak of beams cooling in the night, the distant sigh of wind in the trees. Sleep came easily, deep and peaceful. In St. Mary Mead, the days continued as they always had. Ordinary, kind, quietly beautiful. And somewhere in the stillness, between one tick and the next, the meaning of the stopped clock was finally complete. Not an end, but a brief pause that allowed truth and understanding to find their way home. Good night, dear listener. All is well. Sleep deeply. Chapter 8. The Clock Remembers. Sunday morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with the gentle certainty of all Sundays. Church bells rang across the fields at 8 o'clock. First, the single note calling people to prepare, then the full appeal half an hour later. Miss Marple listened from her bedroom window as she fastened the last small button on her best navy blue coat. The bells sounded clear today, carrying farther than usual on the still air. She came downstairs to find the grandfather clock ticking steadily. It had been running without interruption since Friday evening, its pendulum swinging in the same calm arc it had described for decades. The hands now showed 20 minutes to 9. The chime had rung the half hour, just as she finished dressing. She paused in the sitting room long enough to touch the oak case lightly with her fingertips. "There now," she murmured. "You're quite yourself again." She collected her prayer book, gloves, and a small handkerchief, locked the front door behind her, and walked the short distance to the church along the lane bordered by low stone walls. The air smelled of damp grass and wood smoke. A few late leaves drifted down as she passed under the beech trees. Other villagers were already on their way, families in their Sunday best, couples arm in arm, children running ahead, then being called back with gentle reprimands. Inside the church, the light fell through stained glass in soft reds and blues, painting the stone floor with color. Miss Marple took her usual pew near the front on the left, nodding to Mrs. Pettigrew 2 rows behind and to Mr. Hargrove across the aisle. Timothy sat near the back with his mother, cap on his knee, posture straight but not stiff. Everyone looked much as they always did on Sunday mornings, quiet, composed, part of the same familiar pattern. The service proceeded in its unhurried way. Hymns sung in the slightly uneven but earnest voices of a small village choir. The vicar's sermon short and kind, touching on forgiveness and the turning of seasons without once mentioning clocks or parcels or midnight visits. When the final blessing was given, the congregation rose slowly, exchanging small greetings as they filed toward the doors. Miss Marple lingered near the porch, waiting until most had passed. Then she stepped outside into the pale sunshine and found Timothy waiting by the lich gate. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, touching the brim of his cap. "Good morning, Timothy. A fine day for a walk, isn't it?" He nodded. "I was wondering if you'd mind if I walked back with you a little way. There's something I'd like to say." "Not at all," she replied. "I'd be glad of the company." They set off together along the path that skirted the churchyard, where yew trees stood dark and ancient. For a few moments, they walked in silence. Only the crunch of gravel under their shoes and the distant call of a rook breaking the quiet. "I've been thinking a lot since Friday," Timothy began at last, "about what I did. And what I almost did. I keep seeing that lead weight in my mind, like it was heavier than just metal. It was carrying all the worry I'd piled on myself." Miss Marple walked at her usual gentle pace, hands clasped before her. "Worry does add weight," she said softly. "Sometimes more than we realize until we set it down." Timothy gave a small, rueful smile. I thought I was being clever, using the clocks like that, making time itself lie for me. But it wasn't lying, was it? It was just waiting, waiting for someone to notice. "Exactly so," Miss Marple agreed. "A stopped clock doesn't lie. It simply stops telling the newest truth. The old truth, the moment it chose to remember, stays perfectly accurate. 7:20 was real. It happened. Only the reason behind it was hidden for a little while." They passed the war memorial, its stone still holding the morning's dew. Timothy slowed his step. "I've started paying Mr. Hargrove back already. A few shillings each week from my wages, and I'm helping him clear the leaves from the back garden every Saturday afternoon. It feels right. Like I'm putting time back where it belongs. Miss Marple looked up at him with quiet approval. No, that is exactly what you're doing. Time isn't something we can borrow without giving something in return. But when we do give, honestly, steadily, it flows more smoothly again. They reached the turning where the lane divided, one path to her cottage, the other continuing towards the village green. Timothy stopped. I won't keep you any longer. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for working it out, but for letting it be settled quietly. I don't think I'd have had the courage to tell anyone else. Miss Marple reached out and patted his arm lightly. Courage comes in many sizes, Timothy. Admitting a mistake is one of the larger kinds. You're doing very well. He nodded, cheeks a little flushed, then touched his cap once more and turned down the other path. Miss Marple continued home alone, and when she reached her gate, she paused to look at the garden. Roses pruned back for winter. Michaelmas daisies still holding a few pale flowers. The apple tree bare but promising buds come spring. Everything in its season. Inside the house, the grandfather clock greeted her with the soft chime of the quarter hour. She removed her coat, hung it carefully, and went to the kitchen to make tea. While the kettle heated, she stood at the window, watching a pair of sparrows quarrel over the last crumbs on the bird table. Later, with tea poured and the lavender shawl resting on her lap, she sat in her armchair and let the afternoon drift. The fire crackled low, the clock ticked. Outside, a light breeze moved the curtains a fraction. The stopped clock had told its story, not of crime or villainy, but of a young man's fear, a moment's poor choice, and the quiet power of ordinary people to choose kindness over judgment. The title, once mysterious, now felt perfectly plain. The stopped clock was never about time breaking. It was about time pausing long enough for truth to catch its breath. Miss Marple picked up her needles again. Stitch by stitch, the shawl grew. Soft lavender for a new baby soon to arrive. Life continuing, as it always did, one gentle moment at a time. The clock chimed 4. She smiled to herself. All was well. Very well indeed. Chapter 9. A quiet afternoon's reflection. Monday returned to St. Mary Mead in its usual understated fashion. The sky was a calm, even grey, not threatening rain, only holding it in reserve like a polite guest who knows not to overstay. Miss Marple rose at her accustomed time, performed her small morning ceremonies, and came downstairs to find the house bathed in that gentle, diffuse light that makes every object look a little softer, a little more forgiving. The grandfather clock was ticking steadily now. Its hands had moved through the weekend without falter, chiming the hours, marking the quarters, counting the minutes with the same patient rhythm it had kept for so many years before the brief interruption. 7:20 had come and gone twice already. Once in the morning, once in the evening, and each time the clock had passed the moment without hesitation, as though the frozen hour had never existed at all. Miss Marple prepared a simple breakfast. Tea, toast, a little marmalade, a boiled egg. She carried the tray to the sitting room and ate slowly while watching the light move across the carpet in slow, thoughtful patterns. When she had finished, she rinsed the dishes, dried them, put them away. And then, because the morning felt made for it, she took her knitting basket and settled once more in the armchair by the window. The lavender shawl was nearing completion. Only a few more rows of the eyelet border remained, then the casting off and the gentle blocking. She worked steadily, needles clicking in quiet counterpoint to the clock's tick. Every so often, she paused to stretch her fingers or to look up at the tall oak case in the corner. She no longer needed to study it for clues. The mystery had been resolved, the small human tangle gently unraveled. Yet something about the clock still drew her gaze. Not suspicion now, but a kind of quiet companionship. It had been part of the story, after all, not merely an object, but a witness, and it had chosen, or been made to choose, a single moment to remember forever. And in remembering, it had helped reveal a truth that might otherwise have slipped away unnoticed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How like people clocks are, she thought. They go about their business faithfully, day after day, until something, a speck of dust, a moment of carelessness, a deliberate hand, causes them to pause. And in that pause, they hold a single truth perfectly still, waiting for someone patient enough to look closely. Outside, the lane was quiet. A bicycle bell sounded once in the distance, Timothy, no doubt, on his morning round. She pictured him pedaling steadily, cap straight, shoulders a little straighter than they had been a week ago. The small repayments had begun. The Saturday afternoons, helping Mr. Hargrove, had already started. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced in the parish magazine, just steady, ordinary amends. The best kind. A little after 11 o'clock, she set the knitting aside and rose to make fresh tea. While the kettle warmed, she opened the French windows a fraction to let in the cool air. The garden beyond looked peaceful, the last roses holding on bravely, the hydrangea heads now turned a soft papery brown, the bird table busy with sparrows and a single bold robin. She stood for a moment, breathing in the scent of damp earth and fading leaves. When the tea was ready, she carried the pot back to the sitting room, poured a cup, and returned to her chair. The clock chimed the quarter hour, 4 soft musical notes that seemed to float rather than strike. She sipped slowly, letting her thoughts drift back over the week. And it had begun with silence, ordinary silence made unusual only because it arrived at an unexpected moment. From there, it had grown not through shouts or revelations, but through small, careful observations. A thread caught on a splinter, a scratch near the 7, a parcel left unopened, a young man's fleeting hesitation. Each piece had fitted quietly into the next until the picture was complete. No one had been ruined. No one had been shamed before the village. A mistake had been admitted, forgiveness offered, restitution begun, all without raising voices or summoning constables. Just tea by the fire, a few honest words, and the understanding that people, like clocks, can be set right again when treated with patience. Miss Marple set her cup down and picked up the shawl once more. As she worked the final rows, she thought of the baby soon to arrive, Mrs. Price's first child, due any day now. The lavender wool would be soft against new skin, light enough for cool evenings, warm enough for winter mornings. A small gift, but given with affection. The clock ticked on. At 12:30, she folded the nearly finished shawl carefully over the arm of the chair, rose, and prepared a light lunch. Soup from the pot she had made the day before, a slice of bread, a little cheese. She ate at the kitchen table, looking out over the back garden where a single late butterfly drifted above the Michaelmas daisies. After lunch, she walked to the village shop, not for shopping, but to deliver the shawl. Young Mrs. Price was there, helping her mother behind the counter, cheeks flushed with the last weeks of waiting. And when Miss Marple presented the parcel, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with narrow ribbon, Mrs. Price's eyes filled. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's beautiful. Thank you, truly." Miss Marple smiled. For the little one, may she sleep soundly and wake to gentle days. Mrs. Price hugged the shawl to her chest. She will. I know she will. Miss Marple declined tea. She had already had 2 cups and walked home in the pale afternoon light. Back in the sitting room, she lit the fire, though the day was not truly cold, simply because the flicker of flames felt companionable. She settled once more with her knitting basket, though there was little left to do. The shawl was finished. She had only to weave in the ends. As the light began to slant lower across the carpet, the grandfather clock chimed 4 o'clock, 4 slow, measured strokes. Miss Marple looked up at it. 7:20 would come again tonight, and again tomorrow morning. Each time the hands would pass over that hour without pause, without memory of the day they had frozen there. Yet the clock would carry the story quietly inside itself, the way old houses carry the echoes of laughter and footsteps long after the voices have fallen silent. She threaded the last wool end, snipped it neatly, and laid the completed shawl across her knees. All was in order. The mystery of the stopped clock had never truly been about time stopping. It had been about time waiting, just long enough for kindness and understanding to find their way through. Miss Marple folded the shawl carefully, placed it in tissue paper, and set it on the side table to be collected tomorrow. Then she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Tick, tick, tick. Steady, gentle, unhurried. The clock remembered everything it needed to remember. And now it was free to keep moving forward. Chapter 10. Evening, ticking softly. As Monday slipped into evening, the sky over St. Mary Mead deepened from pale grey to the colour of old lavender. Miss Marple had spent the later part of the afternoon in small, satisfying tasks, airing the best linen, polishing the silver teapot she rarely used but liked to keep bright, arranging a few late sprigs of rosemary and bay from the garden in a simple glass vase on the mantel. The house smelled faintly of clean cotton, wood polish, and the herb's clean green scent. When the light began to fail, she drew the curtains fully, lit the lamp beside her chair, and coaxed the fire into a steady, low burn. Now the grandfather clock stood in its corner, like an old friend who has finished telling his story, and is now content simply to be present. Its hands moved with quiet confidence towards 7 o'clock. The ticking had become once again the background music of the house, regular, unobtrusive, comforting. Miss Marple settled into her armchair with a fresh cup of chamomile tea and the small notebook she kept for knitting patterns and the occasional village note. Tonight she opened it to a fresh page and wrote, in her neat, sloping hand, Tuesday the 18th, shawl delivered to Mrs. Price. Timothy seen on morning round, looks well. Clock chimed every quarter without fail. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and let her gaze rest on the tall oak case. 7:20 would arrive again in a little under half an hour, and she found herself waiting for it, not with any lingering curiosity, but with the gentle interest one gives to a familiar anniversary. At 7 o'clock, the clock struck the hour. 7 slow, measured strokes that seemed to settle into the room like stones dropped into still water. Miss Marple counted them silently, as she had counted them thousands of times before. When the last note faded, she rose, crossed to the clock, and opened the glass door over the face. She touched the minute hand very lightly with one fingertip, guiding it forward until it rested exactly on the 7. 7:20. The second hand swept steadily onward, untroubled. No pause, no hesitation, no ghostly echo of the morning it had once frozen there. Miss Marple watched for a full minute, then closed the glass door again and returned to her chair. And she picked up the lavender shawl, finished now, ends woven in, ready for its new owner, and folded it once more across her lap. The wool felt warm from her hands, soft as a promise. She thought of the baby who would soon wear it, small fingers curling around the edge of the lace, tiny breaths rising and falling beneath the delicate pattern. Life moving forward, stitch by stitch, tick by tick. A soft knock sounded at the front door. Miss Marple set the shawl aside and went to answer it. Young Mrs. Price stood on the step, wrapped in a heavy coat, cheeks pink from the evening chill. In her arms, she carried a small bundle, the shawl carefully refolded. "Miss Marple," she said, a little breathless. "I had to come. The baby. She arrived this afternoon. A little girl, 6 pounds 4 ounces. We've named her Jane, after you." Miss Marple's hand went to her throat for a moment before she smiled, eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Jane," she repeated softly. "What a lovely name." Mrs. Price held out the shawl. "She's already wearing it, just for a little while in the cot. It's perfect, soft and light and just the right color. I wanted you to see, and to thank you again." Miss Marple accepted the shawl, unfolded it carefully, and ran her fingertips over the tiny creases where it had rested against new skin. A faint warmth still clung to the wool. "She's welcome to keep it as long as she likes," Miss Marple said, "and longer, if she wishes. Things like this are meant to be used, not preserved." Mrs. Price's eyes filled. "We'll treasure it, and when she's bigger, I'll tell her who made it, and how kind the lady with the stopped clock was." Miss Marple laughed quietly. "The clock is ticking again now. But yes, tell her the story one day. Children like stories about ordinary things that turned out to be a little extraordinary." They stood for a few moments in the doorway while the night air moved gently around them. Then Mrs. Price hugged Miss Marple, quickly, warmly, and stepped back into the darkness, promising to bring photographs when the baby was a little stronger. Miss Marple closed the door, returned to the sitting room, and placed the shawl carefully over the back of the armchair. The clock showed 25 past 7. She had missed the exact moment of 20 past, but it no longer mattered. The hour had passed peacefully, unmarked except by the steady sweep of the hands. When she poured the last of the chamomile tea, now cool but still fragrant, and sat once more. The fire had burned down to a nest of soft red embers. Outside, an owl called once from the direction of the churchyard. Low, patient, part of the night. Miss Marple leaned her head against the wing of the chair and closed her eyes. The stopped clock had never really been about stopping. It had been about pausing, just long enough for a mistake to be seen, for forgiveness to be given, for amends to begin, for a new life to arrive wearing lavender wool. Time had waited. Then it had continued. Tick, tick, tick. The sound wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once and fell quiet. A window somewhere was latched against the night. A baby named Jane breathed evenly in her cot, safe under a hand-knitted shawl, where all the small pieces had found their places. Miss Marple let her breathing slow to match the clock's rhythm. The evening ticked softly on, and in the gentle, unhurried way of St. Mary Mead, everything was exactly as it should be,